Today, China is a pretty big country. It has a ton of land, a large economy, a giant population, and one of the biggest militaries in the world. But what if I told you that China was almost bigger than it is now? Much, much bigger. What if there was a point in history where, had things gone differently, China would have conquered the world? Well, I am going to tell you exactly what happened and why we were very close to everyone speaking Chinese. You see, in the 1400s, countries started to get really good at navigation. They were rapidly discovering new places, and it was pretty much a given that one territory was going to conquer the undiscovered world. At this time, it was either going to be Europe or China. We all know it was Europe who ended up doing it, conquering the Americas, Africa, Caribbean, India, Australia, and New Zealand. But honestly, it was almost the opposite. You see, China had been a dominant power in Asia. With vast resources, a sophisticated bureaucracy, and advanced technology, it was the envy of the world. And Europe had a problem. It had been fragmented into competing kingdoms. China, on the other hand, was unified under the Ming Dynasty, one of the most powerful ruling houses in history. At a time when European ships were just beginning to venture along the African coast, China was sending massive fleets across the Indian Ocean, establishing trade networks and diplomatic ties with distant lands. The potential for Chinese expansion was enormous. They were right on the cusp of doing what Europe would do in the following decades. Yet, something prevented China from seizing the moment. The early 1400s were a golden age for China. Under the rule of the Ming Dynasty, China was the wealthiest and most advanced civilization in the world. Cities like Nanjing and Beijing were bustling hubs of commerce, art, and education. The Grand Canal allowed for goods to flow efficiently across the empire, while a highly organized government ensured stability and progress. Paper money, printing technology, gunpowder weapons, and advanced irrigation systems made China a powerhouse of innovation. Meanwhile, Europe was facing a vastly different reality. The continent was emerging from the economic and demographic catastrophe of the Black Death, which had wiped out nearly half of its population in the mid-1300s. Feudal wars, such as the 100 Years' War between England and France, had drained resources and slowed recovery. However, despite these challenges, the seeds of change were beginning to sprout. The Renaissance was taking root in Italy, sparking a revival of art, science, and exploration. While European technology was still behind China's, nations like Portugal were beginning to make advancements in navigation, laying the groundwork for future exploration. One of the biggest contrasts between the two civilizations was their approach to the world beyond their borders. While China was sending enormous fleets to explore and expand its influence, European nations were just beginning to venture beyond their immediate regions. Portugal was charting the West African coast, and Spain had not yet unified. China was in a position to dominate global trade, influence foreign governments, and even expand its empire beyond Asia. If the Ming Dynasty had chosen to push further, history would have played out entirely different. So if China was so powerful and could have easily conquered the world, why didn't they? You see, in the early 1400s, China was on the verge of becoming a dominant global power, but a series of critical decisions led it down a completely different path. At the height of its naval success, China had invested heavily in its massive treasure fleet, led by Admiral Zheng He, who traveled across the Indian Ocean, reaching as far as Africa and the Middle East. However, after Zheng He's death in 1433, the Ming government began to shift its priorities. The new leadership viewed these grand voyages as extremely costly and unnecessary. Maintaining the fleet required enormous resources. Ships had to be repaired, sailors and soldiers needed to be paid, and logistics had to be managed across vast distances. Since these expeditions were not directly bringing them money, but rather serving as diplomatic missions, the government saw little economic benefit in continuing them. At the time, the imperial court grew weary of the rising influence of merchants who had profited greatly from these voyages. Many scholars and government officials, particularly those who followed Confucian ideology, believed that trade and commerce should be secondary to governance and agriculture. They viewed the increasing power of merchants as a potential threat to the existing social order. To curb their influence, the government began limiting overseas trade, reducing reliance on naval expansion. With internal stability becoming a priority, China's rulers redirected their attention to maintaining domestic affairs. This meant infrastructure projects such as expanding the Grand Canal and improving irrigation systems were seen as more beneficial to the empire than expensive naval expeditions. Additionally, resources were needed to strengthen defenses against northern threats like the Mongols, which prompted the decision to reinforce the Great Wall rather than invest in overseas endeavors. The government believed that securing China's borders and maintaining stability within the empire was more critical than expanding its distant territories. As isolationist policies took hold, the Haijin, or the Sea Ban, was enacted, restricting oceanic trade and weakening China's once dominant naval presence. This decision, while intended to maintain control over foreign influence and piracy, had the unintended consequence of allowing European powers to dominate global exploration and trade. As Spain and Portugal pushed further into the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, China was pulling back, dismantling the very system that could have made it a world conqueror. Had these decisions been different, had China chosen to invest in foreign dominance rather than retreat from it, the course of history might have unfolded in an entirely different way. Now let's imagine, what if China had decided to continue exploration? Had China continued its voyages, the Americas could have been settled by the Chinese before the Spanish arrived, shaping the culture, trade, and governance of the region in a completely different direction. Chinese could have become the dominant world language instead of English or Spanish, influencing education, diplomacy, and global communication. The global balance of power might also have looked very different, with China controlling major trade routes long before Europe, securing its dominance in international commerce and shaping the economic landscape of the modern world. Chinese culture, food, and political systems could have had an even greater global influence than they do today, leading to a world where Confucian values and Chinese innovations played an even larger role in governance and social structures. The Industrial Revolution might have started in China rather than in Europe, changing the course of modern history by accelerating technological advancements and industrial growth centuries earlier than it did in the West. Imagine a world where the Chinese established trading posts in South America and North America, integrating their technology and culture into these regions centuries before the Europeans. Instead of European imperialism shaping the world, we might have seen Chinese Confucianism, inventions, and governance spreading across the globe. The dominance of Western countries in global affairs could have been replaced by a Chinese-led world order. However, even if China had expanded, it doesn't necessarily mean that they would have become a colonial empire in the same way European nations did. The Ming Dynasty's approach to foreign lands was different from Europe's conquest-driven mindset. China valued diplomacy, trade, and influence over outright colonization. Perhaps the world would have been shaped by trade networks rather than by brutal conquests. So could China have conquered the world? Absolutely. They had the ships, the technology, and the manpower to do so. But a single decision changed everything, allowing Europe to rise instead. The decision to halt overseas expansion remains one of history's greatest what-ifs. Had China continued, we might be living in a world where Mandarin is the global language, and China, not Europe, was the epicenter of world power. But what do you guys think about this? If you liked the video, make sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next one.